Coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And if you regularly follow Midday with Reverend Don, you will know that you can type your comment or question on whatever platform you may be watching this program on, and it will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And I love that aspect of this program. I've been rearranging my office. I really want to rearrange my camera a little bit. It's currently set in a place where I don't normally look directly at the camera. Um, and but with moving and the new location and everything, it's taken a little while to get things where I would like them to be. Um, so I'm still working on that. Our subject for today is various. And that means we can talk about anything we like. Hello to Lynn in the chat room. It's good to see you, Lynn. One of the things I would like to talk about today is to continue the conversation of what people would like to see me talk about. Do you like hearing me talk about metaphysical subjects? Do you like hearing me talk about social subjects? Do you want to see more interviews? What would you like to see? No, hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. And it is an open question because without your input, of course, I can only guess. And historically, my guess has been to talk about metaphysical subjects. As you know, I did Reverend Don's vlog for a decade, in which I mostly answered people's questions on different metaphysical subjects, and that was very enjoyable. Hello to Renee in the chat room. I hope you're doing well, Renee. Um, Yesterday, I mailed out most of the remaining Book of the Deads. I think there are four last ones, mostly going outside of the U.S. to be mailed, and in the next mailing, which should be very soon. I don't necessarily get to the post office every day, but I try to get there several times a week, and we're moving along. Of course, that there are some new orders that will be part of that also that had not even come in when the last mailing went out yesterday. So that's good. We like that. We have lots of things happening, lots of things being discussed for the future. The next book is one of those subjects. We'll see what it turns out to be. Um, which book is next in line? Which book is my next book? Um, and I will probably be working on the next book here presently. One of my thoughts is that what I need to do at this time is to write smaller, more focused books, like the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead deals really with only one subject, although it does have a lot in it for one subject. And it's not a gigantic book like Second Degree, but it's a good sized book. And I'm thinking that that is a good format to focus more specifically on certain things. I was thinking of doing a book on astrology. And I have quite a background in astrology. And astrology is one of the things people have suggested as a subject for a future program. We have made astrology the subject of some past programs. Um, and I guess we shall see. We'll see if that turns into the next book. Many, many years ago, I wrote a daily astrology feature, um, similar to Astro Weather from the monthly Aspectarian, if you're familiar with that, which you might not be after all these years. But it was not sun sign astrology. It was the complete array of all the things going on in the planets on a certain day and what that meant. And that was a lot of fun. But one of the things that I did in connection with that is go through and define all of those different aspects for myself so that I could easily draw upon them on a daily basis. And I was thinking a book like that might be useful. Um, I know that Grant Louis' Heaven Knows What was one of the most influential astrology books I have read. And Heaven Knows What is basically a book like that. It deals with all the different astrological aspects and explaining them for someone who um, perhaps has an astrological background, but is still um, learning how the planets interact with each other It's a very good work in that sense. I was thinking of doing something similar as a possibility. There are lots of other possibilities as well. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to make them. Um, in the advertisement for today's show, I said we would talk about shoes and ships and sealing wax, cabbages and kings. I doubt we're actually going to touch on any of those particular subjects, but it is always interesting to think about the wide range of things that can be talked about. This week, I've mostly been talking about relatively heavy subjects dealing with community issues in the future, um, including politics, infrastructure, and fundraising. So today, we're a little more laid back. I think that those are very important things for us to think about. Not always so fun to talk about. Hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. And there are so many things we need as a community. But one of the biggest ones is critical thinking skills. Hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. And proportion. So often people don't seem to know the difference between what is an important subject and what is not. Or maybe they do know the difference, but they seem to reserve their strongest reactions for the least important subjects. Um, or at least it's often seemed that way to me. I'm a great believer in the idea that you pick your fights. And if something's not worth the time, you don't give it the time. Um, but that is not the online reality. Um, but when we look at our community, I've seen people fight over often very small things. And as a community, we really need to recognize our similarities and pull together rather than pulling apart. Um, we'll see if we manage to do that. Um, but it will make everything in the future so much easier the more we can actually find common cause with one another. And I want to wish a happy birthday to the Most Reverend Alyssa Maxon Kemp. Today is her birthday, the first priestess regent of the Corellian tradition. I hope she has a wonderful birthday. And it is one of various things we could talk about now. Mary says, someone made a mistake on the internet. I'm going to be up all night fighting. Um, but it sometimes seems that way. Um, it it seems like people's sense of proportion often gets left at the door. And I think that particularly when you're in a position of leadership, but really in any life, keeping a sense of proportion is very important. And one of the mistakes I've seen people make over the years is wasting their substance in minor issues that offer no gain if they win, um, potential loss if they lose, but nothing if they win, and taking all their energy. And then when they actually need the energy, they don't have any. And so I'm a great believer in the idea you pick your fights and avoid fighting at all if you can. Now in life we can't always, but generally it's better to do so. And they say the best revenge is living well, and to go forward and do the things that you're here to do is always the right choice, in my opinion, to do the next right thing. And that's what I recommend for people. And so I guess we are talking about cabbages and kings. And what is the difference between a cabbage and a king? And chances are, it's whether or not they can keep their sense of proportion and whether they understand how things actually work in the world. That I saw a comment the other day. What is the difference between fierce debate and verbal abuse? And for years now, I've seen people say they love vigorous debate. I'm not a great believer in vigorous debate. Polite debate, yes. Cordial debate, that's fine. Um, but more often than not, when people say that, what they really are talking about is just plain old fighting. And in the end, everyone has their own opinion, and they have the right to their opinion. So you may disagree. Under normal circumstances, there's nothing wrong with disagreeing. Um, and it's rarely worth making it into an argument. But you do meet those people who just have to do that. Um, and I saw a comment from someone as I was doom scrolling the internet who was very very upset that someone strongly disagreed with them, and I could even see to some extent why they were upset. But they made such a big thing out of it. Someone referred to them as a troll, and then they made it an even bigger thing to prove they were not a troll by doing exactly the definition of trollish behavior. It's better generally to let things pass. And again, do that next right thing. It'll do better for you in the long run. And so, does anyone have anything they specifically would like to discuss today? Today is Friday. Um, Friday has the great benefit of being um, Friday, and I will. I don't. I don't really have a lot myself today, so I'll just keep rambling. If no one chooses to put anything new up, let me take a moment to plug the book, because of course I'm going to plug the book, Corellian Book of the Dead, in mirror image today. But this is available. The vast majority that have been currently ordered are already in the mail or already in people's hands. Um, there is a handful yet to go out, including those newly ordered. Um, but you should have your copy soon whenever you ordered it. We have lots of other interesting books at Corellian.com. We certainly have more coming. Um, it's interesting. One of our recent books is Travel Magic by Lisa McSherry. And travel magic is exactly what it sounds like. It deals with the idea of magic in connection to travel and uses this as an introduction to what also is a good introduction to magic in general. It is a good book, and I highly recommend it. Of course, we have all the degree books. We have the Common Book of Witchcraft and Wicca, or is it the Common Book of Wicca and Witchcraft? I always get that confused. Um, in terms of how we listed it in the title, but that too is a very good book with writings from Oberon Zell and Abby Willowroot and Sir Edward, myself. I believe Alan Salmi is in there. Numerous other writers volunteered their work for that book. It's a very good book. Um, all kinds of interesting things. The Great Women of Antiquity coloring book is available from CorellianPublishing.com. Some of you will remember a few years ago I did a daily coloring page, and eventually it became the coloring book. And what I did for the most part was either a deity or a famous woman from more or less ancient history during that period of time. And it made a very interesting book in the end, and some of the figures in there um, you would have to have a good basis in history to recognize. Um, Others, of course, are quite famous. Nefertiti is in there. Everyone is familiar with Nefertiti, at least in theory. Um, Cleopatra is in there, and everyone's familiar with Cleopatra, at least in theory. Livia Drusilla is in there. But there are also people um, who are there for very different reasons than having been highly placed in politics. One of the first named doctors was an Egyptian woman. She is in the book. The first named author in history, and Hedwana, is in the book. Um, the first individual in history is in the book. And let's take a moment and talk about that person. Operon Zell and Morning Glory Zell described her by the name Crooked Fox, and I mentioned that in the article. Although certainly no one knows what the woman's name was. And her burial site is very famous. She's shown up in a number of places, such as the Clan of the Cave Bear books and other places using different names. But she's been described as the first individual in history because we know so much about her, um, because of the way that she was buried and the items that were found with her. She was apparently a shamaness or priestess, however you want to phrase it, as well as a potter, because she had items related to both of these paths. At the time of her death, her home was burned around her with everything in it, and the village she lived in was abandoned, which suggests that she must have been a very important person. Her body is there, and one of the things that distinguishes her is that her jawline was out of alignment. Also, in the home where she was burned were a number of sculptures, very small sculptures, but several of them are portraits, and they're among the earliest realistic portraits that exist. And one of them shows a woman with her jawline out of alignment, which is assumed to be Crooked Fox, or whatever name we're going to describe her by, which makes her the first subject of a portrait in history um, about whom we can say this was her profession, this is her body, and even these are her fingerprints. Because since she was a potter, and since some of her work was still in process at the time of her death and preserved by being burned in this way, one of the things that survived are her actual fingerprints. And these things are more than can be said of anyone else at that period in prehistory. So she's quite an interesting figure um, in existence and quite an interesting karma. And it makes you wonder more about who she really was. Um, but all we're really going to know about her is what we've just said. Um, Everything else we can imagine, but those things we know, which is very fascinating. We talk about in that book, oh, a number of female military leaders from antiquity, such as Artemisia, who, in addition to being the queen of Halicarnassus, was one of the great naval leaders of the time. There are many other interesting figures. So that's one of the many projects I've dealt with over the years. I have a completely unpublished book here, somewhere in this office, on historical costume. It was meant to be a paper doll book. And back in the day, I used to collect paper doll books because I found them a very good source for artistic inspiration because they were very detailed. And they often dealt with historic periods, sometimes very realistically, sometimes not. And I wanted to do one of my own. So I did a wide range of fashion from the ancient world. And if I can find that one of these days, maybe I'll scan it and go ahead and bring it out. Um, I have to say that in the years since doing it, because it's probably 30 years old, um, I've learned more about fashion in the ancient world because everyone has. Things like Otzi the Iceman taught quite a bit about prehistoric fashion because of the fact that his clothing was preserved. Um, Not that much clothing from the northern parts of Europe is preserved from that period. So it makes it a little difficult to say what people were wearing. We have a much better idea today than we did 30 years ago. Um, there is more artwork that has been uncovered in those years showing a wider range of clothing than we formerly thought people had. And above all, the coming of the internet has made more and more information available than was once available. Back in the days before the internet, you had to research this sort of thing with books, and what you could find out was mostly what was in those books, unless you were in a position to go to original sources, which were paintings and archaeological sites, um, all of which also depended for their thoroughness on how many you could go to. I have some wonderful books on the history of fashion from, say, the 1950s, which are very interesting and for later centuries quite thorough. But if you look at what they had to say about earlier periods, they can be rather limited because less was known at that time. Um, it's a bit of a jump, but I was recently watching in tiny little bits on YouTube what I guess was a mini series on Amazon Prime on Cortez and the period around him, which had a very interesting portrayal of the Aztec leader Moctezuma and the Aztec people in general. Apparently, one of the more accurate visual depictions that I have seen based on archaeological evidence, and beautiful, uh, beautiful piece of work. And to look at how much more is known, for example, about pre-Columbian fashion today, pre-Columbian culture today, because of ongoing archaeology. Um, we know a lot more about the history of the Americas than previously. And we know it goes back much farther than it was previously attempted to be said. There's a wonderful book called 1892, which talks about the Americas before uh, encountering Columbus and company. And that book points out that there had been lots of evidence long before saying that the population of the Americas went back much farther than academia had been willing to admit, and that it had been intentionally covered up. Um, and this is not a fringe book. And by the time it came out, all of this was well known. But you go back to the 70s, and the evidence that was coming out saying, that you're putting this way too late, um, was completely brushed over and covered up whenever possible. And it really speaks to the extent that people's prejudices have influenced their understanding of history and archaeology. Um, and that only continues to become more and more obvious as we look at, first and foremost, how much farther back things go. Um, One of the more interesting things discovered in my lifetime is the Göbekli, um, oh, the temple that they found in Turkey that is one of the oldest structures and yet complexly carved. And it really changed the attitude for when settled civilization developed and how these things developed. Let me just take a moment to double check that name, and then I can mispronounce it for you. Yeah, Göbekli Tepe. Um, But that was a very fascinating reset of archaeological ideas, and many others are happening even right now. Um, it'll be interesting to see where that ends up. Um, but one of the things that was pointed out to me by Sir Edward long ago is that early archaeology was heavily influenced by conservative Christianity, who were doing it largely to try to prove the historicity of biblical accounts, something which in the fullness of time it absolutely did not do. But that was part of their reason for doing it, and part of how they reached certain conclusions. And if you go back and read archaeology from the early part of the 20th century, this becomes much more obvious. Um, and for example, if you consider the Hittite Empire, the Hittite Empire got its name from a group mentioned in the Bible to whom they're completely unrelated. Um, but an archaeologist along the line wanted to use them to say, look, we've proven this group was really there, because the names sounded slightly similar. Totally different group. Um, doesn't mean the other one wasn't there, but it does speak to how the prejudices of the archaeologists of that time influenced the conclusions they chose to reach. And that's always worth bearing in mind anytime you're studying any kind of history. Um, in the 70s and 80s, it was very fashionable to go back and revise history based on amateur medical um, conclusions. And you will find, or sometimes amateur psychological conclusions, you'll find all kinds of things about certain famous historical incidents or people based on the sudden discovery of some illness they supposedly suffered from, most of which has subsequently turned out to be not particularly sensible. Um, I'm certainly not saying that's a bad thing. We should always be reconsidering things, but it's been one of the interesting historical developments in my lifetime. Um, People do tend to love to figure out mysteries, and that's understandable. One of the big things is the idea that George III suffered from porphyria, um, which he may have, but there are actually quite a few questions connected to that. Because in certain ways, his symptoms do not actually align with that at all, unless you're cherry picking them. Exactly what he was suffering from really isn't known, and it probably never will be because the different things it could be weren't known at the time. Um, and what was written down is not necessarily enough to judge by. Another example, there was a lot of talk about a particular, I believe, American president who they thought must have been poisoned because he died so unexpectedly. I believe it's the one who died after eating too many cherries. And if I remember correctly, this went far enough for someone to actually exhume and test the body to see if he had in fact been poisoned. And no, he had not been poisoned. Whatever killed him was something more natural. At the same time, um, the last Chinese emperor before the revolution, who was followed by Puyi from the last emperor, and that famous film, The Last Emperor. There was a lot of historical accusation that he had been poisoned, and finally his remains were tested, and oh yes, he was. He was poisoned with arsenic, and there's no question of that now. Um, Question of who did it, but no question that it happened. So it's very interesting when we go back and reassess history, and sometimes we turn out to be right, and sometimes maybe not. Particularly looking at history from European assessments of other parts of the world. When you look at early 20th century assessments of things that were going on in 19th century China, and look at them with modern knowledge, they're often, shall we say, rather heavily colored. And one of the one of the ones that I find particularly interesting is the death of the pearl concubine, which will mean nothing to you if you're not familiar with the era. But for years, people have insisted that she was murdered because the Dowager Empress was just that kind of person, basically. But one of the things that's come out over as more information has become available in the Western world, the Dowager Empress was not that kind of person, and the death of the pearl concubine was more likely from an ordinary illness at a unusual time. But these are some of the things you find. So I think we can say we've talked about the equivalent of shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings today. And I will see you again on Monday when we'll probably talk about something more focused. Hello to Jan in the chat room. It's good to see you, Jan. And I hope you have a lovely weekend. And let us close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives, and we pray that we shall go forward together, hand in hand, for many years to come. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you to help us to see clearly those things that we look at, to help us not to allow our prejudices and assumptions to color our vision any more than is necessary, so that we may see accurately the things we look at. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks, and knowing you're always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence now and always. And may you now and always be blessed. And I thank you for your presence. I love you all. I love talking with you at this time each day. And may you too, now and always, be blessed. And I will see